Alright guys, welcome back to another podcast. This is episode number 37 and I am joined by Stefan. Where's Craig gone anyway? He's disappeared. Yeah, Craig is doing his own stuff for a bit. He's doing his yoga training. So I thought I would continue on the podcast and I thought I would invite a good friend of mine from Block. How did we meet, Stefan?
I think it was at the onboarding for Block.
Oh, the one in London.
So August 19, we went down to London together and we sort of crossed paths. I remember we had a great chat. You told me that you were very close to taking the robes. You know, you were ready to just run away at that point and become a monk. And I was like, I want to chat to this guy more, you know. So It's taken us 2 years, but I'm really glad to be in conversation with you, man. And of course, we had a conversation before we started the recording and, you know, we've gone a little bit into depth and it's really funny having that conversation and then going, maybe we should be recording this.
Yeah.
Because there was so much juice in that conversation, but I think what we really started to tap on was like, I'm really interested in hearing your perspective of how the East and the West interact or contradict, and so are you from my perspective and vice versa. So we've got this real keen interest between us and obviously a lot of devoted study and practice into these philosophies, both mainly of the Eastern tradition, right? But that's now been interpreted so much in the Western, you know, last 50 years or 100 years in the scholarly level. So it's really interesting to meet and discuss. And from that little discussion we had before, it does sound like there's so much resonance and so much reverence really between our shared knowledge. And because when we come together like this, I think we've come at it from different angles, but we can really nourish the whole fertile understanding and come together and share these ideas and say, well, these are, you know, really well refined and practiced ideas. Like, how do they work in life?
Yeah, 100%. That was a good summary there of what we were talking about just previously. But yeah, I think the viewers are used to Craig and I starting off the podcast saying, oh, well, we probably should have recorded the conversation about half an hour ago. Okay. So this is nothing new. It's just quite embarrassing that we've done it with a guest. This is the first time I've done it with a guest where we've talked for at least about half an hour to 45 minutes. And that's half the podcast pretty much done there. And we've got an understanding of what we want to talk about in the podcast, which is, again, it's a first time thing because we normally just go with the flow and see where the conversation takes us. We're going to do that, but we're going to also maybe narrow this conversation down, go into these little nitty-gritty topics of East and West. I was going to say East versus West, but we're in a time where now it really shouldn't be East versus West. And I guess this brings us to our first topic, the whole issue with the whole yoga movement. And to be fair, I've never mentioned this before publicly, or I don't think I've even mentioned it to friends before, but I had that stigmatism for a very short period of time. But then I started to ask myself the question, what is it that I think yoga is? What is it? What is yoga defined by the way I see yoga? And really, that immediately cancelled out the whole, you know, the conflict, if you want to call it, in my head, that if anything, yoga is more alive now than it's ever been in the last, I would say, 200 years. You know, there have been a few individuals here and there from India who've come to the West, for example, Yogananda, who've given their knowledge to the West and really given them the actual interpretation of what yoga means to the East and how we practice it. And then the West has gone and done their stuff for a bit. If anything, they have stripped yoga to this basic practice of stretching. So if you ask the normal average person on the street, hey, do you want to participate in a yoga class, or do you know what yoga is? And they'll give you the basic textbook definition of the Western interpretation of yoga, which is just bending moves and pretty girls on a yoga mat. Mainstream companies have exploited that, and now a lot of the people in the West, the average person, like I said, thinks that that's what yoga really is. But you and I both know that's just scratching the surface, if even that, you know, a tiny little hair.
There's a lot of stuff there, which I want to respond to even before I begin to forget. The idea of Eastern and Western, and which you started to summarise on as well, the reductive approach of Westernism. If you ask your contemporary Westerner on the street, you know, like your average Joe in the UK, hey, what's an antibiotic? And they'll say, I don't know, it's that thing that the GP gives you for like most things. But most of them won't even know that. So, you know, when it comes to yoga, I'm writing a teacher training now, finally, after teaching for 5 years and practicing for 13. And, you know, one of the points of that is, if you look in the Western Oxford English quintessential dictionary of definitions for the English language, like a widely accepted one. You don't have a word for yoga, so the nearest one we could have a look at after that is meditation. And in meditation, all of the similar words that it suggests, I mean, first of all, it describes the process of thought. And then all the similar words, I think there was about 15 of them are all thoughts, like thought forms. And then there was one that was prayer, reverie, or finally concentration. And I was like, okay, so 3 out of 18 start to get close, but still it describes practices in the Patanjali system more of, prayer being Ishvara Pranidaha, and, reverie being maybe a state of vritti where the mind is sort of kind of lucid but not really on anything specifically until it gets the concentration. The dharana, before meditation, dhyan can happen, and then you get samadhi, which is this bliss state. So we don't even have an English word that is anywhere close to yoga. And then another thing you mentioned was, well, what is yoga? It helped you to look at what yoga is. Chris Wallis talks about this a little bit. He says, is Patanjali referring to the state or to the practice? And is derived from a bunch of other Hinduistic and Buddhist traditions. The practice is an oral tradition handed down from guru to sisya, and there would be these people who had devoted their whole life to it for many, many years as a mental restraint, psychological practice, a philosophical inquiry into the nature of being itself, which is what it primarily was and really should be. But because it got popular, because we have a world of like Western reductive thinking that says, okay, so you need to fix this condition, let's cure your symptoms, whereas a lot of the holistic Eastern, Chinese, Japanese, and also Tibetan and Indian systems will say, cut to the root, get to the root. And you were talking earlier about the environment. There's a very interesting idea of the nature-nurture debate. There's some revealing things about that, in that if you take an adopted child into a family that are prone to cancer, then even though the child doesn't have the same genetics to begin with, the epigenetics of that family, more often than not, they'll actually develop the cancer. So it's the environment that is so important. And this is where the Eastern holistic mind comes from. It's sort of like seeing the collective first. And I think there is this tendency for the reductive mind to be like quite solipsistic in nature, and solipsistic and like kind of stoic, So a lot of these like really ancient Western philosophic traditions would be, some of the like Plato and Aristotle, like they're the revered minds who the Oxford English Dictionary then thousands of years later goes on to say meditation is about thinking. Like it comes from the whole thought concept of like thinking. Whereas Harish Wallis, who was an American-born scholar but really devoted his whole life to it, and the understanding of Sanskrit and many other languages, and lived in ashrams for a great deal of time. And when someone's like, okay, you're really like absorbed into this blissful awareness and able to convey it through your language, both poetically and intellectually. Harish Wallis, I sense, has very devoted sincerity in his spiritual approach, and he talks about this idea that vrittis, which are the fluctuations, which are one of the primary, I like to think of it as like sort of ping pong balls, like a thought just going back and back, stuck in like a little corner, that's like a vritti. But he would call them a mental emotional fluctuation, which again speaks to that more holistic nature of Eastern understanding of avidya, the ignorance of, just not seeing the whole completeness of everything. And the Western mind, I believe, having been brought up in a Western country, in a mostly Western epigenetic like sort of makeup, my family are from Eastern Europe, a little more heavily weighted than a little bit more than the UK genealogy, but there's also a bit of Turkish and Greek in there as well, so it's It's like a bit of a mongrel gene pool that I'm from, but I was brought up in Bolton, which is near Manchester in the UK.
Yeah, so that's where you and I are both from.
Yeah, you're from Bolton as well.
I'm from Bolton as well.
That's crazy. Yeah. Just discovered that. Were you born in Bolton Hospital?
I wasn't born in Bolton. I was born in India. I moved here when I was 3 years old.
Yes.
But, it's because of the community of Hindus that I come from. Most of them in the UK were set in Bolton, Manchester, etc. So it was an easy move when we came to the UK to move to Bolton, and then over the last 20 to 30 years, people expanded around the country, London, Cardiff, a couple of people in Leicester, and just across the country. But I didn't want to cut you off. Come carry on. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, the Eastern understanding seems to me to be much more inclusive, holistic about the environment, as you were alluding to earlier, and whereas the Western seems to be much more interested in this reductive idea. But, we're going to get it talking into, like, the colonial context of everything, with Shyam Ranganathan. He's got a really great but very in-depth, very wordy, intellectual translation on the Yoga Sutras, because we were talking about how he mentions in that book how there's no one definitive translation, and every time you go from culture to culture, if you have to go from that broad holistic view into the reductive view, how do you know the mechanisms with which that to actually convey the truth and the essence, the satya, of that actual, the meaning of that practice, specifically when sutras and like a lot of the Vedas as well, which more of an oral tradition passed very anciently, like there's talks of the Indus Valley civilizations as its roots, so it goes back really far, like thousands of years, and Patanjali's exposition on it, which is commonly accepted, is a much more modern phenomenon, though its roots are deeply buried in that Vedantic principle of duality and non-duality. And the first thing you started to talk about was Eastern and Western, and it's kind of interesting as well, whereas in a very, very rough way, because it's a concept that came to my mind as you were saying it, not an hour ago, but we could look at perhaps what if we take a broad comparison of the Eastern approach, this holistic view, as non-duality, and what if we take the Western approach as duality? There's a lot more to it than that. And as you know, when you start to look at non-duality, you really start to question the nature, and it gets very difficult to describe in words. So it's important that we maintain the essence of feeling. And what a lot of the text showed us, the scholarly approaches and a lot of the traditional texts that were handed down in visual form of the Sanskrit written word, was that they are actually away from the tradition of oral transmission. And to actually get the oral transmission to fit and make it memorable, they sort of changed a little bit of the wording in the Sanskrit and the arrangement of the grammar in order to fit into the verse of, like the Sanskrit measure, to make it easy to remember to sing. So there's this really interesting cross wave of, like, this is the written tradition and this is the oral tradition. And what are we doing now? Well, I think, as you alluded to also in your introduction, I'm going to have to go and discover what yoga is for myself. I sometimes have thought of it like maybe like Shiva is represented in the written text and the this Yoga Sutra translation we have, and all of the translations of the mantras, which are like kind of this coded version of the Akashic records, and then it's through the interrelation with the guru and the sisya, the teacher and the student playing roles, because ultimately it's all Brahman, but the actual inquiry and the practice is called yoga, but then the actual promised result is called yoga as well. So that's another Shiva Shakti comparison we can make. But, Shakti means the manifest. It means the material, the prakriti to the Purusha, which is Shiva, divine consciousness itself, this pure, non-necessarily embodied. That's why you have the lingam, and you have the Shiva, the formless version, where Shiva is just represented as like a mound of stone, because it's a symbol of his formlessness, is, immaterial, whereas Shakti is the manifest is, the creation, the movement of energy, energy as well as matter, and perhaps even time, but there's a lot of philosophical debate to have there. So it's this practice that we engage in, and it's interesting that in the West, which has typically been like thinking means meditation means thinking, therefore yoga probably means thinking. Oh no one wants to think, so let's stretch instead because it gives you endorphins and feels good. That's another story. But it's the antibiotics things. Like, you've created this scientific and medical priesthood in the UK where it's like, okay, authorities in white coats have power, therefore listen to them and don't think about it, and they know, and then they're given a very reductive approach of let's cure your symptoms, whereas in the East it's kind of like, okay, so here's everything, now you become the priesthood, you practice and you navigate through all these different practices and new experiences. Patanjali says the most valuable form of knowledge is direct experience, and then valid testimony. So much more important than what your guru is teaching you is what they can show you about your divine awareness shining through. Yeah.
Now, again, you've gone into so many different topics there we can go into this podcast, but I want to pick out a few. So let's start off with this idea of different definitions or interpretations of yoga, which lines up with, so for a Western mind, and again, this is not to put any of the Western people down, because like you said, what was his name? Harish
Wallis.
Wallis,
Wallis,
so
the Tantra Institute.
He's an interesting guy because he spent time in the East to fully understand what the East meant to him. And again, it's what it means to him as an individual. That is basically the framework that the East works from. That's my interpretation of the philosophies in the East and the teachings. So, for example, you mentioned Shiva there. If a Western person, and even an Indian person who's been brought up in the West, Western culture, goes back to his roots and tries to understand and comprehend what the texts are saying about just the term Shiva. Shiva can be the divine energy that you're talking about, the formlessness of the universe. Shiva can also be the destroyer, the Devta, that we call them Devtas, but I think the best translation for that word is a demigod. There are three demigods: Vishnu, Brahma, and Shiv. So Shiva is the destroyer, Brahma is the creator, and Vishnu is an observer. So Shiva can also be described as that essence that is the destroyer. So by going into these books with a completely blank mind, or a mind where you don't understand what interpretation of the word is defined in that particular in that sentence, I should say. So
can I jump in to ask to clarify?
Yeah,
Thank you. Would you say then that the Devata approach, the Trinity, Shiva as the destroyer, was more of a Vedantic idea and this kind of pre-medieval?
Yeah, I think so. But I think when you say Shiva, that interpretation of Shiva also become the majority of what mainstream Hindus now interpret as Shiva. So for example, in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, he does mention Shiva, and the interpretation he's coming from is, I feel like this is what Sadhguru is talking about, which is the formlessness of the universe. In order to have a manifested universe, it has to come out from nothing. So Shiva basically means that which is not there, basically. That which is not it is Shiva.
Neti.
Neti, yeah. So that's something that isn't there.
Pardon my pronunciation. Neti.
It's fine. But yeah, and just by me saying this, that's probably confused a lot of people anyway. I've probably confused myself, because it's trying to conceptualize what these texts are saying. And I've had that question, and a lot of Hindus growing up, I've had those same questions about there's a debate that's been going on in my sector of Hinduism about who is the creator of all the creators, so the final form of the universe, the incarnation of all of the avatars and all of the gods that have come, who is the creator? And there's been a debate whether it's Vishnu, Krishna, Shiva, Brahma in some debates, and it's very difficult to pinpoint who it is. But the problem is, it's like what you just said, it's using the reductive ideas of the West and trying to put that on an Eastern philosophy. So a lot of the Hindus, like my generation and people that are slightly older than me, have actually got into heated debates trying to debate who is the top dog, if you want to call it, the person who's created the entire universe. Which avatar, which incarnation is the top dog? It's been difficult, and a lot of us, there's been two sides to the debate. There's been the side that's actually got in there and debated this question, and there's the side that says, why are you even asking this question? Like, what framework is this question coming from? Because each incarnation has had a purpose. Each incarnation comes from the same root, so why do we need to have this debate? Like, if an incarnation is basically the form of the previous one, and you're dressed in this garment right now, tomorrow you decide to wear a different garment. So what's the difference between the person that wore the garment today and the person that wore the garment tomorrow? There is no difference. It's just the clothes that you're wearing and the exterior is different. So that analogy describes the situation that this debate is having. But the higher question is, why are you even having this debate? That time that you're having, that you're thinking about these ideas, you're reducing your mind to thinking about these ideas, you could be spending understanding the deeper essence of life itself. So most people these days are getting into debates of which god is better than the other god, and instead they should be working on, how is that affecting me? What am I doing in terms of my spiritual practice? What am I doing in terms of my dharma? What am I doing in terms of my career and helping the people out around me? Those kind of things, that's what I'm interested in, not who you think is the bigger avatar or the incarnation of God. That kind of stuff.
Are people sort of extrapolating this debate from Vedic principles? Yeah, from Vedic texts. How would that interplay with two things? Bhagavad Gita and Sri Ramana Maharishi.
Yeah, so that's the other thing. The Bhagavad Gita itself has so many different translations. So when Krishna says to Arjuna that I am the incarnation, I am the god of all gods, I've just taken a human form, in certain translations, Krishna is saying that I am the form of Vishnu. So is Krishna the creator of all creators, or is it Vishnu? So this is what I mean. It's a debate that really doesn't need to happen, but it only happens because we're reducing it. We're reducing it down. We're watering it down. We're sensationalizing it because we can't comprehend beyond the intellect. And I think Sadhguru really does describe this situation really well. He says there's a big difference between intellect and intelligence. Intellect is what gets you, basically helps you survive. It's the tools that you've been given to interpret the world in the most basic form, which is, we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Once all of those have been taken care of, then you can really go into the deeper essence of the mind and what it is to be thoughtless. So when we were talking about meditation, and our goal in meditation is to be thoughtless, but for a lot of Western people, having a distance between thought and not having thought is a form of psychosis. Like, how can you, in a way, it's a form of psychosis, because how can you not use your thought? Because that's how you interact with the world using. So to distance ourselves from the thought means that we must be going crazy. So that's one of the reasons why when we start to use reductive methods of trying to understand the Eastern approach, you're always going to hit a barrier or a pothole, because you're never going to fully understand it. So the way to do it, and we were just saying this before the podcast, is to go into the environment, go into the Eastern environment, spend time with the East without having any judgments to what's happening in front of you. Go in there, do the damn thing, spend time with them. When they say try fasting for 72 hours, do the thing and see how it's worked for you. See how the body reacts to it, see how your mind reacts to it. And then once you've done it enough times, then you can extrapolate a definitive answer for you. And it's mainly that, it's the answer for you, because your answer will always differ to my answer. Yeah, and there is no right or wrong answer in that, and it's fine. We're fine to say, this is what your experience has been through, what you've gone through. My experience going through the same process that you've gone through is different, and it's okay to be in that state. But for some reason in today's world, the way we exist, we can't exist unless one approach is right. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's the reductive folly, it's the trapdoor of reductivism. I asked about the Bhagavad Gita, and we went down the Krishna route and the incarnation route, and Krishna's implication there. You also touched on Chit and Chitta, and you also touched on the cultural aspect and the experiential part of the practice, which is where the insight lies. That all ties us back to my other invitation, Sri Ramana Maharishi, who you may or may not have talked about on the podcast, but he was generally kind of secular, right? His approach was, in those debates, for instance, where people are looking and saying, oh, well, what is the name of the ultimate God? Or like, maybe it's deeper than that for some people as well. Maybe what is the characteristic? What is the character of God? How can we discern quintessential inherent intelligence, like you were talking about Sadhguru's difference between intelligence and intellect. Intellect we could parallel with Gita, which is consciousness, which Harish Wallis, this Westerner who spent and absorbed himself into the experience of the Eastern ashram life as a scholar, but not quite as a monk, although his practice is deep. He talks about Chitta being mental and emotional fluctuations as well, because there's a bit of a sort of loose end on this idea of trying to rid of all thoughts as a goal for practice. So Ramana Maharishi would say to those people who were talking about these devatas and choosing which one was the winner, he'd probably say, who is asking the question? And he'd bring it back to the experiencer, and his book was simple, and he was like a bit of a rebel when it came to, he was very much like this Shakti style experiential teacher. He was giving effectively where the guru gives, wisdom through the presence and the experience of just questioning. Take all the books and, you don't need to read them. All the knowledge you've accumulated all brings you back to the experience of you. Yeah. You are the listener of this podcast. You are the one having the experience with the brother in front of him, So it's like you're the one experiencing it, and Ramana Maharishi would get in there. Krishna himself in the Bhagavad Gita, in one of the most famous set of verses, 47 of chapter 2, Karmani avadi karaste ma parashu karachana ma karma parahitu bhamate sangam swakarmani yogastaha kuru karmani sangam shakvadanam jai sadyo sudyam samabhava samatvam yoga uchate. Involved in the process, not the fruits of the actions thereof. If you're going to have a debate about who's the big devata with the shiniest balls, then you're just looking at the result. And this kind of takes us back to that idea of duality, non-duality, the holistic and the reductive. Are we trying to reduce? Are we being in a dualistic state, saying this is one end, this is the other end, we can see everything in between? Or are you just absorbed into the practice and the experience of bliss, where thoughts may come and go? Mental, emotional fluctuations as well there, and the navigation. Harish Wallis uses, I've looked into this guy's teaching a lot because he speaks to me as a Westerner. He comes from a Western culture, so he's like saying, hey guys, as you alluded to, even in the different Hinduistic traditions, there's interpretation, which has meant the essence, the neti has been lost, and it's become, sama's like something, or something competing. Yeah, Harish Wallis speaks to me because he says, look guys, right, okay, so this is the condition we're in as Westerners. Let's just look at that first. And he has a real important emphasis, through his tantric teachings and through the teachings of Patanjali. He's talking about, hey, Westerners, how you're trying to do stuff to feel good all the time? How you're just completely obsessed with feeling good and it's not working? Yeah, well, recognize that before you look at this Eastern stuff, because it's not about feeling good. It's about the divine ultimate truth and your awareness and your access to the divine ultimate truth. And byproduct of that is feeling good, but it's not the goal. And if you make that the goal, then you're going to be shooting in some weird direction of yoga's about stretching.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because there is this, even in today's society, there is this push for self-love and moving away from doing things that are not gratifying for you. We would see that in the East as a very egotistical form of thought. Self-love should exist without even having to mention it, but not in the sense that, today I'm going to take a day off and give myself time to give myself a pedicure or something. Not in that form, in the sense that the East has always taught from a very young age, to be fair, that this life is misery. Simple as that. Life in this aspect of the universe is misery, because this is what we're here to do. We're here to pay off our karma and go through the process, so then we do the best we can and we move on to the next life, and we continue this cycle until we've paid off all our karmas or we've hit self-realization. So at any point in life, whenever you feel like, oh well, life's not being fair to me, it's not supposed to be fair to anyone. We're here to suffer because we're supposed to go through this life and learn a lesson through it. and that's all it's about. It's about growth. And all of the books, there's not a single book in the Vedanta, or even in the East, like in the Buddhist traditions or the Jain traditions, that talks about this life being, all about happiness. We're seeking happiness in the West, but happiness doesn't come from out there. We know this. We've said this in the West and the East, that happiness doesn't actually come from out there. It comes from within. But for the West, what does that even mean when it comes from within? Well, they'll say from your emotional state and how you feel on the inside, using that framework as, how do I feel about the world and how does the world impact me? So let's say, you and I meet on the street and we have a bad encounter. Yeah, we have, 99% of the time we have great encounters, but that 1% of the time we have a bad encounter. Now, I could be someone who's super stoic and super, relaxed and a person that doesn't react to situations, but that one situation that put me off guard because I expected it to be a particular way. The Eastern approach would say it's because of that expectation, that tiny little expectation that you had of, oh, I'm living in blissfulness, which means that my frame of mind and my state should always be in bliss. All of this should be in bliss. We don't understand what that means in the West. We think that the way you react to the world has to be in the form of bliss. You have to be in that state in your mind in order to accept bliss in the world. But in the East, we don't think in that way. We think in the way that the world exists as a separation from you. You are a separation from the deeper you, the Atman that resides in you. So you're not the body and you're not the mind. But, I think the West hasn't fully understood what that means, because we don't understand that there's something else that exists within us that is separate from the body and the mind. So I think until we get to that stage, there's always going to be this separation or this difference between the interpretations of the West and the East. And whenever the West try and understand the interpretations of the East, there's always going to be this pitfall of duality. Yeah.
And we looked at the fact that in the Hinduistic traditions you have interpretations which had led to disagreements. You have it in the West as well. And if we were to compare the true essence of Eastern yoga to something in the West, it would be psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, and psychology.
Yeah.
And we have big proponents of that in modern times. People talk a lot about Freud and this idea. For a long time in the 20th century, it sort of formulated a lot of the understanding that people worked with. More so now, I feel, or maybe it's just a bubble I'm looking into, one of his I think maybe students he was mentor to for a while, but I think they actually worked alongside each other more, was Austrian Carl Jung, and who lots of people have heard about his work in the archetypes and lots of really interesting things. And Jungian psychology is something that I've read up on a little bit because it just drew me more. You don't need to look around to see Freudian psychology. It was already there in my ambient upbringing, and that's what people were talking about on like Frasier and shows like this. The culture brings it through, right? The Western culture. I wasn't learning about Freud through, Chinese or Indian shows, that's for sure. Yeah. So that's the thing, is like we're always getting messages from our old culture, feedback from our own culture that becomes this like echo chamber and resonates louder and louder, the common attributes. You were talking about stereotypes earlier. So anyway, the sort of Freudian model became really popular, but it was quite reductive. And as you were talking about holistic versus like separative ideals and dualistic approaches, I was thinking about Jung because he has this beautiful quote: you can take a bag of stones and you can know how many stones are in there, like population, and you can weigh the bag of stones and you can say on average they weigh this much, like you were talking about, just treating the 70% or the 80% of people. Even though if you take that whole bag of stones, the average, you'll never know the exact measurement of a single one of them. So when you're just trying to go so let's put a template onto all of society and then say, and we'll sort of use it for everybody on an average. It's not going to work for anybody, let alone everybody, or let alone even a large proportion. So the Jungian approach is big into dream interpretation, which is a much more akin, I believe, in my very limited knowledge, but to, I spent 2 years in Australia and I learned a little bit about the native dream time, which is sort of like the modern day mythology.
Right.
And, earlier on you were talking about this idea of the redundancy, and maybe we can dig into that a lot more when we talk specifically about racism, colonialism, and its after effects. There feels like this essence is being, challenged. Like, I mean, we've not even started talking about namaste, and I think that's a really interesting conversation, because it's going in my teacher training manual, because I want people to understand the cultural context, not just the traditional, but also the way it was misinterpreted in modern day, so that people have an appreciation of, okay, this is the landscape I'm moving into. What can I extrapolate from this? How does that resonate with me? How does that not? Because Patanjali was compiling all of these, Buddhist and Hindu ideas. Specifically, most of the practices were really, really resonant with Buddhism, apart from Ishvara Pranidhaha, which is the devotion to the Lord. That's like the direct translation, and it's agreed amongst scholars that that's what it means. But it seems out of tune because so many Buddhist practices, and then Buddhism was non-secular, and it was about, this cultivated divine mind, just symbolized by the Buddha. He wasn't seen as like a devata, although, the richness of the Eastern, I spent a year, 6 months actually, in India, but here and there in Sri Lanka, and, like gaps in between, so it added up. But the feeling of absorbing myself into the Indian culture was like, there's like, I remember going into the supermarket, and it was just a super noble transaction. I wasn't buying anything spiritual, but the guys in there were like, I think actually this was in Kerala. Went to Kerala for a little bit, and Varkala and places like this to, sort of going to the southwestern coast. I actually wanted to surf there. Yeah, and I was in a supermarket in Varkala, and these guys are like, "Sir, what is your name?" And I was like, "My name's Stefan." And they were like, "What does it mean?" And I was like, okay, so the etymology of it is actually crown. So it means crown. And they were like, Sasarara chakra in the supermarket. And I was just like, wow, these guys are like talking about like serious, like, like chakra energy body stuff, like in the supermarket. It's just like, so, and you have temples on the side of the road, and it's just all really close, So for any Westerners that haven't visited India that are interested in yoga, you won't necessarily learn a particularly useful approach to asana, because it's much more about the classical body there, right? Most people aren't sitting on chairs, they're sitting like this, or they're squatting a lot, or they're carrying heavy objects on their head culturally. Old ladies on a building site carrying like 15 breeze blocks on their head at age like 60, 70, probably older as well. And you're just like, okay, so that's a headstand prep, like you're good for headstand. People squatting, you're like, yeah, you can stick your legs behind your head, and that's like generation upon generation. So another thing that's lost in the modern approach to yoga is like, let's just try and do the shapes that Indian and Chinese people do. It's like, good luck, because these hips, it's probably not good for my body to sit like this for prolonged periods anymore. I did it for a while. I was like, I will sit like low down for an hour to meditate, and I used to, and then like, I don't know, maybe I'll just start taking chairs or flotation tanks, man. Eventually formal meditation practice becomes how you exist in day-to-day life anyway. So
I think that's the key there, how you exist in day-to-day life. That's what the problem with, if you want to summarize Western interpretation of yoga, maybe that's what the problem is. It's not based on these fancy poses and stuff, because like you said, in the East, most people, you would think like in India, in a place where yoga originated, that people would be completely proficient with all of these poses, but no one gives two shits. A farmer in the farmlands doesn't care about poses. He might be super spiritual, he might be going to temple, but the poses are a very small aspect of the whole of the yoga philosophy and lifestyle, I would say. We always like to label something. So, if I say this is a door, you know exactly what I mean when I say it's a door or a cat, etc. We always want to label something based on a particular word. Whereas in the East, it's more about doing things, letting the thing exist, and in a certain area we would call a door something in a different sort of way, describing what the actual thing does and what it is. So for example, we go by sounds in India. Cats, we would call a cat something else based on the sound it makes, whereas over here we have a completely different word where a cat should be ideally called a meow, because that's what it does, right? Using the Eastern approach, you attribute the sound of the creature or something, a characteristic of the creature. Maybe it has spots or something, and you call it a particular name based on the description you see it as, or whatever it does. But in the West, we have this idea that we need to label it as something that is nothing related to the actual thing itself. And maybe that's what our framework has come from. And that's why when we say yoga in the East, they'll just say, well, it's a state. It's a state of being, like a lifestyle, what you do. And most people, they'll say, and I think, I don't know who I listen to, but most modern day yoga people, like if we say someone who practices yoga in the West, who's spiritual and is deeply entwined by the teachings, doesn't actually even mention any of the words. Like I never use the words. I say the words if I'm going to talk to a monk, so then I can get a particular understanding of what the word is and how to go deeper into it. But day-to-day life, if I'm going to say this fancy word and say it to someone who has no idea where I'm coming from, all you're doing there is you're saying to people, I can say big fancy words, and that's my interpretation of the whole issue. Is you don't need to use these fancy words. I get it, like, because you have a relation, you have an honor, or you have an obligation to say, well, this word is obviously the traditional word and I need to use that word to respect the culture. Honestly, like as Indians, maybe there's a few people there, but most of us don't give two shits if you call it a downward dog or you call it the actual Sanskrit word. And it's the same as, like you said, about the namaste issue. I've talked to a friend of mine who's a yoga teacher, and she was asking me about it. She goes, how do you feel about it? I was like, if you use it, great. I don't take immediate offense to it. I don't take immediate, oh, this person knows something about my culture. I mean, that'd be a great situation to be in, to say, oh, you know more about my culture. So, for example, you just quoted the Bhagavad Gita. I probably know the first 2 or 3 verses, maybe a bit more. First 10 verses by heart. But beyond that, it just goes over my head. Whereas you quoted chapter 24. Not chapter 24, chapter 2 verse 24. Right?
Verse 44, I think.
Shows how much I've been paying attention.
But they're really specific ones that I've learned over and over again because
they
it just
mean
happened
something
to
to you
be
as well.
the mantra for
Right.
the Yoga Synergy system, which I learned. And also, they're recited very commonly. I think those 2 specific ones by Indian school children to this day, right?
We got taught Yada Yada Hi Dharmasya, which is the one where, when there is destruction, evil in the world, I will take birth as an incarnation on this earth. So Yada Yada Hi Dharmasya, Glan Nirbhavati Bhavata. I don't know the rest of it now. Abhyatam Dharmasya Tadatmada Sunami. Something like that. I got it wrong there, but yeah. So that's the main we got taught, and that's one that says, whenever there's evil, and there's negative or ignorance rising, then I will take birth and re-establish dharma. And it's all about dharma. It always comes back to re-establishing the dharma.
So that's the thing, is to understand dharma, it's very difficult from the Western mind. And Shyam Ranganathan talks about it in his very deep, I keep flashing this in front of the camera, but it's really good amongst many to have a deep perspective and appreciation. He's talking about the fact that dharma is this own set of moral consequences or procedures or explanations, or if you want to really get into the wording of it, because we're talking a lot about interpretation. When you're talking about interpretation of dharma, you've already sort of shaped it to your own ends. If you're not all fully aware of your kleshas, your blockages and your accidental unconsciousness and unconscious biases. So Carl Jung, the sort of antithesis Western psychologist to Freud, talks about the shadow and the unconscious shadow and how it enacts as its own kind of characteristic underneath the layers of the ego. The moral significance of dharma, I can get back to you right now from my own experience based on the time I spent in India and some good stories from there and experiences. But I think I'd like to really dig into this translation of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, because he's studied a lot of philosophy, and Eastern and Western as well, and he's saying that you've even got interpretation within Hindu, you've got interpretation within Western, trying to teach itself Western philosophies. The richness comes where, I lived in London, and if you wanted to go to India and you lived in London, go to Wembley, and you'll get really authentic street food and temples and clothes shops. If you want to go to Jamaica or the Caribbean, like go to Brixton, and you're like, there's so much of that culture there.
Yeah.
So the shadow side of colonialism is that, it was based on imperialism, let's take over the world, and we're looking for pleasure, and this will give us material pleasure, will be good. And obviously the amount of suffering, like Holocaust level suffering going on throughout the history of colonialism from the European settlers of France and Spain and Portugal. Portuguese weren't actually as nasty as a lot of the others, but you had all of this stuff happening where like that just gives a massive blind spot. I hope in future we can talk specifically about Namaste and the use of it in the culture around it, modern yoga culture, but I hope also we can get into depth about colonialism and the big blind spot that leaves, and racism, the inherent racism in there, which people are like, oh, I don't need to look at that because I'm not racist. Doesn't matter, you're in a big racist cruise ship, and the destination is racism, like you're on it, like that's what colonialism is. And now that's the shadow side of like all that negativity, and people like Black Lives Matter movement saying, yo, Western imperialists, look at this. And most of the people who are non-conscious participants, but therefore, they're not against it, so they're carrying it along, are kind of like, I don't need to look at that because I'm not racist. It's like, yeah, but have a look at what your culture sort of done and what culture you have, and there's a big blind spot. So maybe just try to be open and to listen and to be humble and to surrender, like in this debate that the different sects of Hindu are having about like who is the greatest, Devata is like, that's a similar kind of issue of just like, there doesn't need to be like a sort of hierarchy and a winner. So it's kind of like, where is the conversation practical, and what shadow is that casting on the potential for spiritual insight? But then the light side of it is this, the holistic way is like, if you change the environment, like if you look at this genetically, if you have a richer gene pool, you have like offspring that are more resilient against disease, that affected the formers. So and then living in London, you've got all these cool cultures, not just food produce, but it's actually like the culture is there and it's embedded. And look, like people got a bit of a warped idea of what yoga is, but there's something they know that's really juicy in there that they need to get to. But I love Harish's approach, the American guy who lived in the ashrams, because he's like, okay, let's just notice the stories that we have around just trying to make things good. And you were alluding to this idea of a lot of Eastern teachings being like, suffering is this, fuel, or is this compost from which the divine grows, the symbol of the lotus flower. But what you were saying, when there is suffering, I will come into birth, this consciousness blossoms out of unconsciousness. So it's kind of like you have the unconscious approach of like, I'm trying to get something out of this practice, even though the practice is trying to teach me I'm everything. Yeah. And I think maybe we could go deeper into it as well and get into some specifics, but not make it too textbook and maybe too clinical and boring for people. But talking about Advaita Vedanta, talking about Samkhya, and talking about Patanjali as three to compare, because Patanjali out of those three really is the only one that says, hey, yoga is the practice as well as the state. We know that it's the state of yoga. That has a really important emphasis. That's a big thing that I want to like cross-check now that, granted, I think he's Western-born Canadian, Shyam Ranganathan. I think he was born in Canada, but he certainly lives there now. But he's of Indian origin and descent, and he's also a really deep philosopher of both Eastern and Western philosophies, because now he knows all of the interpretations that made up the Western philosophy to a greater degree than many others, and he also has that experiential awareness, and he can see the interpretations, and he's all about this explication. Explication is saying you can't formulate a decent reflection on a theory unless you have been able to absorb it into the culture or to get the cultural influence from it, because we're talking about spirituality, but we're also talking about the culture, the compost, the suffering from which it emerged. So it's going to look different. So in a patriarchal, like sort of imperialist culture of the West, you had Christianity and Islam, like these monotheisms where there's one guy who's the boss and like he's all powerful, and it's like that's just a reflection of the culture at the time. So the Vedas and, you know, these sort of prehistoric like religions, like a lot of tribal, you know, very, very ancient religions were just interested in the elements, much like, you know, the Vedas allude to some extent, the Upanishads. They talk about Ayurveda and this concept that let's not overcomplicate it, let's not get too reductive, but let's say, okay, we've got 5 elements, and, you know, what amongst those? Or in Sankhya, like, let's say, you know, we've got Purusha and Prakriti, you know, like, and then from that we've got Sattva and Rajas and Tamas. We've got these 3 different qualities, you know. So without getting too reductive, there's a really useful thing. But we need to recognize, as Christopher Harish Wallis talks about, for a Western audience, which is really useful for me. You know, I want Eastern teachers, I want Western teachers as well, because hopefully they've unwrapped and unpacked a lot of the conditions which were hidden away through the inability to look at the nature of, you know, coming from, you know, a great deal of suffering in the colonial aspect. It's just to say, you know, it makes a huge difference if you say yoga is the state or yoga is the practice. And yeah, when we get more time, I'd love that to be a topic as well. Yeah,
definitely. And we also want to add that, you know, it doesn't belong to anyone. Yoga is, you know, it's your thing, however you see it, and it doesn't belong to anyone. Yogananda, his guru, Swami Yuthikshwar, he mentions it straight. He goes, anyone who tells you that yoga or any practice of the East belongs to that person is a person you don't want to listen to. Because, first of all, yes, it originated or it was cultivated in India, but the practice of yoga has been there for, you know, time immemorial. We don't know how old it is. It's just that we learned how to refine it, because we, in the East, it was, again, just using, they say, a lot of people, especially modern day mystics or gurus like Sadhguru, will say that yoga, they'll define yoga, or they'll mention yoga as a yogic science, you know, or the Ayurvedic or the Vedic science or yoga science, because it's basically that. It's a form of science where you observe how the practice works for individuals, and then you try and collect this and create something that works for everyone. But then again, you say to people that it's based on interpretation and how it works for you. So as soon as that framework is put into place, then you can go away and try and discover what it really means to you. And maybe that's what we're lacking here in the West. And I've always felt like in Western media, whenever an Indian is described or is shown, it's always, there's been a joke about it. You know, for example, The Simpsons have depicted Apu, and here Ganesh. There's an episode where, you know, they're having a ceremony and someone's like dressed up as Ganesh and this and that, and we see it lightly. We've never taken anything too personally, because that's just how our culture is in the East. Like, people have their own opinions and interpretations, but the way we've been taught is let them have those opinions and interpretations. You know, no, there's no issues. As long as it doesn't result in violence and, you know, personal attacks and stuff, then you probably need to step in line and just say, look, this is not how it should be. Now you've gone too far. But if it's casual and it's done as a joke, no problem whatsoever. But I think with this whole movement, and we said that with colonialism and all this kind of stuff, you know, they're serious topics, but at the same time, you've got to look at them in a way that you're not holding, what's the word I'm looking for? Ancestral pain. You know, for example, the Native Americans and how the Native Americans were slaughtered in America, and that wasn't that long ago, 200 years ago, 250 years ago it happened. And a lot of the people there have carried the ancestral pain of their ancestors, but they haven't done it in a very in an aggressive way. There hasn't been this stance to eradicate all the white people or stand against white people in America by the natives. The natives' culture is they believe that, and maybe this is one of the tribes, but they believe that this is Mother Nature doing her bidding, basically. They've had a period of harmony, and even then they had cultural issues between the tribes and stuff, but you know, that's another story. But there's a lot of you know, they had a lot of respect towards nature, and whatever happened in history has happened. But you can't go away now hating everyone else. You can't go away and hate white people, because you've got to understand this generation is not the same as the generation that existed back then. Even like 60, 70 years ago, when racism was a big thing, it's a different generation. So for us to have that ancestral pain, that's normal, but to have that ancestral anger and hatred That's not normal. That's something that we need to look into. Yeah, you can ask any Indian, but most Indians generally don't really participate in the spiritual aspect of Hinduism. That's just a complete fact. Most Indians that have moved to the West don't really participate in any of the Western countries. America, the UK, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Most don't even practice it anymore. And that's fine, you don't need to, but then you can't come along and say, well, they've taken this and they've taken that. If you don't practice it, then what's the issue there? If you're more of a Western person, what's the issue there? And the second thing is, the yogic texts specifically say, in all of them, in the Vedanta, in Buddhism as well, you're not the body, you're not the mind. So any attack on the body and the mind is not a direct attack on you. You're the Atman. You're formless. So whenever someone says that yoga belongs to India and this and that, it contradicts what the teachings already say anyway. Like, it doesn't belong to anyone, and we're not the body or the mind. So if I'm brown and you're white, what difference is that? It shouldn't be a difference. It should belong to everyone. And the other thing you talked about with colonialism is the whole, when the West went over to India, and also when the Muslims from the Middle East went to India, and then the Mongols, Indian people generally most people would just say, well, these people came in, destroyed our country, and we were stripped of our culture. But at the same time, we allowed it to happen to ourselves. We were so politically involved in our caste system, and the original caste system that was created in a way that creates jobs for particular people. It wasn't to say, well, I come from the low caste and you're from a Brahmin caste, which means that you're higher than me. It was never for that. It was just to allocate jobs and tasks and duties and dharma to particular groups of people. It wasn't to have a hierarchical structure. So it was the top guys, the Brahmins, a couple of Brahmins, not all of them, but it got to a stage where a couple of Brahmins thought, well, we're studying all this and we're learning about all this. What are these people on the street doing? They're doing this. They're cleaning up the dead carcasses of cows and dogs and whatever on the street. So we're supposed to be superior here. We're considered higher because we're having to do all this education. It was done to ourselves. Colonialism happens because a nation comes in and obviously destroys part of your culture and destroys part of the people as well. It's the genocide that happened. But like I said, we're no saints either. We did it to ourselves because we're too bothered about, well, if you're born into an untouchable caste, you can now not apply for the duty of a soldier. You're not a warrior because you weren't born into the warrior race. And by doing that, whenever the country was under attack, when the people that were supposed to defend them, the warrior caste that was supposed to defend them, they didn't know how to defend the country because they were born into warrior families, but they didn't have the characteristics of being a warrior.
Sure.
The original system was created based on your characteristics. Are you someone who likes to serve the world? Not someone who scrapes the dead carcasses. That's part of it, but are you someone who likes to serve people? Then you belong in this sector. Are you someone who's more scholarly and who's an academic? Then you belong into this sector. Are you brave, chivalrous, etc.? Then you belong into this caste. Or are you a businessman? Then you belong into this caste. That's how it should have been. And because of our
bureaucracy.
Our bureaucracy and our issues with trying to just get along with people and almost like trying to oppress our own people in our own countries, in our own country. I think that's what led to the downfall of India, because 250 years ago, India was the biggest empire in the world. Mm-hmm. Not because of trying to destroy the nations. It was the biggest empire in the world based on our spices and our robes, our silks and our materials and our knowledge of the yogic knowledge. Everyone wanted to go there. Like Alexander the Great has many stories of him going to India.
And also being in reverence of some yogis he met. The famous story of Alexander's whole carousel, his whole fucking army just being like stopped in the middle of a road by a yogi sat there. And they were just like, Alexander the Great coming through, this guy's just taken over half of the world. You're naked, you're in a loincloth, you're in the way. Shufti, son. And he's just like, okay, well, who is this guy? He's Alexander the Great, Well, what's so great about him?
Yeah.
Well, he's taken over half of the world. And what have you done? You just sat in the middle of the road in a loincloth. And Yogi looks up and says, well, I've overcome the need to take over the world.
Yeah.
And then Alexander the Great, allegedly it's a story, it's a myth. But Alexander the Great's like, I want you as an advisor. Come on, jump on the carousel. Let's ride together. You know, he was obsessed with the fountain of youth and this promise of infinite bliss consciousness that was alluded to by the yogis. So there's some really interesting early crossovers between Eastern and Western there. We're definitely getting into a new podcast, and I'm so excited that we are. Like, I want to get clear on the other subjects, but I want to respond in a final sentence with Swami Satyananda's quote, because I've given so much of my life to learning about the Eastern perspective, and I've always been enticed and seduced by the promise of enlightenment, which I very quickly to respond to. I think it's important to listen and to hold space for the suffering of others. Karuna, compassion, this is one of the things that's taught. So it's like, okay, there is suffering here. Where does this come from? This suffering is so damaging, and that same sutra you can use from Patanjali, Maitri Karuna Mudito Pakshanam Sukha Dukkha Punya Punya. So is it in response to ignorance? If you perceive it and you believe it, then do nothing, because there's nothing you can do there. Yeah, if you sense suffering, then be compassionate. And one of the greatest things to be compassionate is to go, okay, you're having an experience of suffering right now. Let me offer you whatever comfort and support I can from a place of friendliness, from a place of divinity. And the Indians did that to the colonialists that came in. They were like, we have these principles, ahimsa, satya. So first of all, our most important principle, according to Patanjali, who summarized a lot of important teachings at the time, do no harm. So that means materially, yes, you're going to be imperialized, taken over, massacred, and your industries completely pillaged. And that was what happened. It's sad though it is. In fact, I mean, it's
100% true.
It's the darkness of the human soul which we all carry with us. There was potential in every human to do that, given the wrong environment, which, there was a big wrong environment that led to Western supremacist imperialism, right? And which is still pervasive today. There's still an ongoing issue. Look at Bangladesh, look at the Ivory Coast, in Australia, they're still kicking native people off their own land because they're saying, oh, you don't have normal family units, you live in tribes, it's not right. Now we're going to put, an oil we're going to drill for oil here, or we're going to make a coal factory, or whatever terrible things they do. It's happening now, and it's the nature is promised us. And I understand, how the suffering can arise, because it's like, if you just hear something which has been revered and practiced with sincerity for millennia, and then it's that surface is taken to be the depth of it. Okay, sure, there's maybe some misunderstanding that there's material ownership, but that's a misunderstanding of my own. If I say, you're just a misunderstanding the material outcome of it, it's all based on my perspective, and it's saying that I have a klesha, I have an attachment there, that I'm saying, oh, I don't see myself as a body, but I see that one over there as a body, and your body's wrong, you're doing the wrong thing, then that's not karuna anymore. And we come back to that practice again and bring maitri, bring the loving kindness until it's actually there's no resolution I can make here. I can't fix this within myself or in the other. I just need to walk away. Definitely. And I hear the suffering of people that say their culture, because I think if you're tuned into this, it doesn't matter what culture you're from, you're like, okay, well, we have a shared experience of consciousness, we're all existing in different bodies, but this is completely immoral, and this is, materially blind, and it's, it's tragic for the spirit, but the spirit's, untaintable and changeable. And just last thing to slide in that I'd love to do another talk on is the ego and gods.
Yes.
One thing that the East and the West shares is that in a lot of their mythology, the gods were scared of humans. The humans were a threat to the gods in both sets of mythologies. There's some interesting Vijnana Maya Kosha stuff to dig into there before we get into Ananda Maya Kosha. So that's another whole episode again by itself. But I want to close with Swami Satyananda. Yoga is not an ancient myth buried into oblivion. It's the present pressing need of this present moment. So I sort of ad-lib that because I can't remember the exact quote, but I want to make it my own as well and say, you know, Swami Satyananda says that, like, we need this right now.
Yeah.
You know, Atta Yoga Nushasanam is how Patanjali's sutras, famous sutras, start. Now is the exposition of yoga.
Yeah, perfect. And we're going to wrap it up there. So, like Stefan said, we can go a lot deeper into these topics, and, you know, the time frame that we've given ourselves and the topics that we were going to cover was probably not enough. We probably
like
missed
4 or 5 more hours to go.
We really did misjudge the time that we needed for this, but yeah, which is perfect because it means that we can do this more often, and especially since Craig is still quite busy with his yoga training. So yeah, I'm definitely down for a part 2, a part 3, maybe a part 10 all the way, and it'd be nice to kind of go into each of these topics individually and go into trying to understand it, trying to bring it down to a level where the modern generation can understand what's going on. And perfect, mate. Any last words?
Well, I know it might not mean anything to you, but it means something to me to express Dhanyawad.
Dhanyawad. Yeah. We're done.
Thanks, Chet.
Yeah. But yeah, this is the other thing I was going to say. It's humbling and it's amazing to get that reaction from any Western person that comes, or any person that's different from India, who respects and appreciates the culture. It's taken to heart perfectly the way it should be. But yeah, it's just I don't understand how it can be interpreted in a bad way. I don't see that. Maybe that's what my what's the word? You know, when kids are so pure, they don't see anything bad in the world. In that sense, I don't see that ever when someone says something in my language. Maybe they say it wrong as well. There's no personal sort of attack made on the individual there. So yeah, I'm not going to waffle on because we're going to go into another topic afterwards. Right, so this was podcast 37.
I believe so.
Yes, good. So Stefan is the accountant here. You can remember all the words. Podcast 37, and it'll be on the usual platforms. Spotify, Instagram will have a preview. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube. And yeah, I think it's also on iTunes as well. So anyone who's an Apple person, it'll be on iTunes too. Perfect. Thank you so much, Stefan. And we shall see you in part 2.
Thank you.
Done.